Again, hello everyone. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Tim Hodges, and together with Julian Portilla, we will be facilitating the next 2 hours discussion. On behalf of the DSI Informal Dialogue Partnership, which is funded by the Government of Norway and the European Commission, thank you for joining us today, and a very warm welcome to everyone around the globe. The title of the webinar is somewhat awkward, but I think it's actually we'll deal with some very central questions related to CBD COP Decision 16.2. And the title of the webinar is Exploring the Implications of CBD COP16/2 Provisions on the Multilateral Mechanism for Benefit Sharing from Digital Sequence Information. Before I turn to my co-facilitator, Julian, to say a few words about the genesis how we got here to this webinar and really what the aim of the webinar is. And before introducing today's esteemed panelists, I'd like to start off with, as we often do, with a brief Zoom poll. This is where we have an opportunity collectively to see from what regions and from what sectors people who have joined the call are coming from. So please do click the options, and then we'll reveal the result. Let's have a look at the regions. Interesting. Without undue commentary, it's quite interesting that we have more than usual from Asia and the Pacific, and we have 4% from other. Again, I'm curious, but let's not get into that. Let's now look at the sectors, if we could. Probably no surprises, but it's good to see there is at least a range of sectors as well as regions participating today. Thank you very much, Stefan. Now for the agenda. And thank you for participating again in the poll. This is just the key features of the webinar. Of course, we have introductions and some background, and we'll have some closing remarks. And obviously, thank yous as well at the end. But here are the core elements of the agenda. The first round of panel discussions will be centered on the following terms and in the following order, not as indicated here, but we're going to start with publicly available and then move to entities, indicative rate, and direct/indirect use. Following that round, we'll move to a second round where we encourage the panelists to have further contemplate what they had said, but also what their fellow panelists have said. So it'll be quite an interactive session as well. And then finally, the third round is an opportunity to bring everybody who's on this call and who've contributed to the discussions in the chat, ideas and comments, to actually integrate those bring them into the panel for the panelist consideration. So really quite looking forward to the third round as well. It's more expansive than usual, and I think that's a very good thing. And certainly, we've heard that in the past. People are interested in more interaction. So let's see how we do with that. So the chat is open, as I mentioned, and please do feel free to use it. And we have our team in the background diligently watching the chat and collating and bringing together sort of thematically some of the key and prominent issues that you and concerns or ideas that you raise to bring that to the panel in the third round. Right. So let's have Julian take the floor, if you would, to talk about why we're here and what the aim of this webinar is. Over to you, Julian, and welcome.
Thanks, Tim. Nice to hear you. Nice to see you. Welcome, everybody, from whatever time or place you are in. My name is Julian Portilla, and I'm in the northeastern United States, very close to Montreal, actually, Tim's work base. I work for the Centro de Colaboración Cívica in Mexico, and we partner with GeoMedia and team on this dialogue partnership. And delighted to have you all here today. We have been um, thinking about this webinar for quite some time. Of course, COP16 has created something quite novel. And one of my favorite teachers used to say, first we fight over the words, and then we fight over the meaning of those words. She was a mediator. And so the terms that have come out from 16.2 are at the same time common in usage, but also specific to this context. They may mean different things to different people depending on where they're standing. And of course, how you interpret those things has serious implications for the scope and breadth of 16.2. It has implications for who might be expected to contribute and in what amount and under what circumstances. So the terms that we've chosen for today is not a comprehensive list of things that are of terms that are in the decision, but rather they are terms that come up repeatedly in our conversations and interviews with many of you who are on this call. We're frequently in contact with people from different sectors, industry, government, indigenous people and local communities, representatives, NGOs, academia, and so forth. And often in our conversations, these four terms have come up, and so we wanted to have an opportunity to explore what they might mean and to whom, what might be reasonable interpretations of what those are, and what might be reasonable interpretations that may differ. So we've invited some very distinguished guests, some of whom you'll be very familiar with, and others maybe not. But we're excited to try to advance understandings of what these different terms could mean and what their implications are. Yeah, I think it's a good start for now. Tim, we'll get into more details very shortly.
Super. Thanks, Julian. Don't go away because I'm going to ask you to join me in introducing our speakers, as you mentioned, almost immediately from this point on. Stefan, could you please upload our... Okay, good. And I think if it's possible, we could have all the panelists' cameras on for the introductions. It's a bit awkward because there's many screens, but let's, if you would, thank you very much. Julian, why don't you kick off the introductions briefly for the first
Absolutely.
panelists? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, well, we have Agatha Makaska-Curran. We have her actually via a recording because she was unable to come today. She had another obligation, but she's an environmental economist and PhD researcher at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics. She works on biodiversity finance. She has been looking for quite some time now at the revenue potential of the Cali Fund and the distributional properties of its allocation formula. She's a consultant to the CBD Secretariat on the operationalization of the Cali Fund, and she's written quite a bit on this. And if you haven't had a chance to look at her work, I highly recommend that you have a look. Some of it is published on the CBD website, her and her team. And there's also Paul Oldham with us today from Tierra Viva AI, which is a new startup that's using artificial intelligence to promote biodiversity-based innovation and local solutions to global environmental challenges. He directs One World Analytics, and he has also done a lot of thinking and written a lot about these topics. And then we have the pleasure of having Daphne Young Dervais with us, who directs the Global Network Policy Engagement at the International Chamber of Commerce. And she supports the ICC's global network of national committees and members in 170 countries in the different areas of ICC's policy work. But she talks a lot about ABS, and she coordinates business engagement in the CBD discussion on ABS and DSI. And she's a frequent contributor to these discussions, so we're delighted to have her as well.
Thank you, Julian. Why, if you would care to keep going, please do. You're doing a wonderful job. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Okay. We have Pierre Duplessis, a veteran of global negotiations on ABS and DSI. He's represented Namibia in related policy processes at the CBD, FAO, WIPO, and WHO. Of course, all very relevant areas for our DSI discussions. And he's currently helping to set up the DSI Financial Readiness Coalition for Africa. We have Hugo Maria Schali with us, former advisor for international environmental negotiations at the European Commission. Uh, a lot of experience negotiating and policy architect in the EU and international environmental affairs. Delighted to have you with us, Hugo. Also, Maui Hudson, professor and director at the Te Kotahi Research Institute and council member of Local Context, working on intersecting issues of indigenous data sovereignty, indigenous biodiscovery, and ABS and research reciprocity. Also, we'll have Marta Lucia Cepeda with us, member of the DSI Scientific Network, Director of Technology Transfer at SciPhage, SAS, a Colombian deep biotech spin-off of the Universidad de los Andes, and a research associate at Corpogen, which is one of Colombia's leading biotech research centers. She has a background in research management at two Colombian universities, bridging biotechnology, intellectual property strategy, and regulatory affairs across academia and industry. So we are delighted to have you all with us, and it's going to be a really interesting conversation, Tim.
Thanks very much, Julian. Again, welcome, and thank you, panelists, for being available and willing to share your thoughts, very well-informed thoughts. And it's going to be a rich discussion. I know it will be. And we've got a remarkable, and I don't often say that, but we do have a remarkable panel today. So thank you very much. Well, without further ado, we were going to move to the first round of panel discussions, and focusing on the key terms that have been mentioned previously. We're going to begin with the term publicly available. And before turning to Mauri and to Merta, we will do this for each of the four terms, prior to each of the four terms being discussed by a range of panelists. We're going to ask Suel to start us off with a précis of the desktop research that our team member Katrin has conducted on each of the terms, to kind of give you a sense of its common use of the term, and how it, or maybe uncommon, but the range of uses and understandings of each of the four terms that we found through that research. We think that would be a great way to just start off without prejudicing discussion of the panelists, just to get a sense of the range of possibilities and of understanding. So, Suel, please, over to you.
Yes, and good hour of the day to everyone. Suel Al-Janabi with GeoMedia, also supporting together with Julian and his CCC team the informal DSI dialogue process. Yeah, so what I'm going to do is to share with you what we found, and what we found on terms, be it in dictionaries, be it in other international fora and contexts, on the terms that we just have mentioned, including now also, of course, this publicly available. And we followed a little bit, of course, then the example of what we had in the past, when there was also a bit of discussion on the term material, and then also some background research on the meaning of material, whether it's material or immaterial. You may recall, helped really then triggering off a lot of constructive discussions in the DSI negotiations. So when looking at the term of publicly available, and this of course has to do with the scope of the MLM and the DSI and the Cali Fund, as you see above. In the common meanings, it is information accessible or obtainable by the public, basically by anyone. And it focuses rather on accessibility rather than the actual use. At least that's what one finds in the dictionaries, the Oxford Advanced Learners, and so on. It is in international practice often interpreted quite broadly and relates to information that is publicly available, even if access requires, for example, registration, user accounts, payments, and the underlying common principle, I would say, is that publicly available is not the same as unrestricted access, what has also been found. And use of publicly available information may be restricted, can be subject to certain conditions, like, for example, in patent information. Now, looking at where there is some potential ambiguity in relation to our decision 16.2 is certainly the question what level of restriction would be or could be compatible with publicly available. Could there be a publicly required registration, paywall, licensing conditions, restricted access databases? So what is the pool basically of these digital sequence information, genetic resources that is made publicly available, as we see above, and is describing the scope. And so, as I said, it may have possible implications on the scope of DSI covered by the mechanism. It may have possible implications in relation to the consistency of implementation across sectors and jurisdictions, and in that regard, potentially also with respect to legal certainty for the users of DSI. So just to frame and spark the discussion, and over to the moderator and the panelists.
Thank you very much, Suel. I think that was very interesting and very helpful and a great kickoff. So we are, without further expenditure of time, going to move to our two distinguished panelists. And Maui, why don't we start with you, if you would? We'll give you 3 minutes, and then we'll move to Marta. So over to you.
All right. Well, Kilda, thanks for putting this together. It's always hard being the first one, but look, I think from my point of view, and I'm speaking from a sort of someone that's been involved in a lot of the conversations around the development of the care principles. And I think the context part of this is, really recognizing that how data governance was seen as important, and it refers both to the FAIR principles and care principles. I think publicly available, I'm actually not sure what the challenge around the definition here is, in part because it generally relates to open databases, and that's what we've been talking about for a long time: open science, open data, and those things have been supported by the FAIR principles and how it encourages that to come about. Now, a little bit of the flip side of it, and this is probably the balance, at least with the care principles, is that reflects Indigenous concerns about the lack of appropriate attribution on these open databases or publicly available data, and also some of the level of control which might be exerted in relation to it. And so you see this leading to the establishment of some Indigenous controlled databases. And I think this is it's just going to become a part of the spectrum between private databases and public databases. But I don't think it will ever become a significant part of the ecosystem. Now, I agree with the common meanings that have been shared here. And I think if we look at places both around whether databases are available, but publishing, people in publishing places where there's an expectation that the data is available in open places for people to access. In that context, there's always exceptions for things like if data compromises ethical standards, participant privacy. There could be legal or commercial reasons why there is a restriction around making that access to that data unrestricted, but it still has to be known that it's there in the way that you can get there. If I was thinking about some of the kind of the nuances that have been put in place around what the ambiguity is, registration to get access to data, okay, I think that's fine. Having a paywall, I think that's probably not. licensing conditions is okay. I think, being able to see what the Creative Commons license is, or local context labels in relation to data sets is fine. I think as soon as you get into restricted access databases, and also with requests from owners, I think there's a sort of like a maybe space. And the reason I say that is whenever people are doing that is because they want to be involved in the conversation about what's the pathway to access, what's the pathway to benefit sharing. And so if you're controlling the nature of it, if you're controlling it for a privacy reason, then you're probably happy for it to roll into a Cali Fund sort of outcome. If you're interested in having more of a say about how that use of the data might lead to a bilateral agreement, then that's what's going to happen when you engage with the database or with the data owners. And so kind of they can negotiate their own terms through that process. So I think largely the publicly available is anything that's in the kind of open spaces, or you can, I guess it's publicly known and you can access, and it's got some kind of agreed uses around. But I think that's my 3 minutes. I've got other things to say, but it's probably kind of enough for this point in time.
Super. Thank you very much, Mary. And I'm going to come back to, we have time, sort of further describe this maybe space. Sounds quite interesting, I have to say. Please, Malta, you have the floor. We look forward to hearing from you, and welcome.
Thank you, Timothy. Well, I think Maui mentioned pretty much everything. The only thing that I will add is just keep this open access, because this is a matter of numbers, right? It's a sheer matter of numbers. From my perspective and my experience managing research that has to do with DSI, the logistics, the operational part, the administrative part, being publicly available means being unencumbered, right? So this allows the production of the new knowledge, which is downstream in a value chain, what produces the advancement, the development, and all this information that allows to accomplish what we are looking with the CBD. And the idea of this is because we are producing a huge amount of DSI and consuming a huge amount of DSI. And it's because of the sheer nature of DSI. In context, we have to analyze between thousands and thousands of sequences in this publicly available database. So if we think about it like a highway, if we have restrictions, it's like putting toll booths every 10 feet of a highway. So the idea is perhaps, and thinking about this maybe space that Maui mentioned, is the fact that we have to think not if we have restrictions or we have this checkpoints, is when and where in the value chain. So it could be upstream, it could be where we put it, but the nature of publicly has to be kept in essence. Maybe the idea of this publicly available databases also must include what or which kind of metadata are we using, and going to the part of who is accessing and who is using it and who is depositing. Of course, we need to have this type of information in this metadata space. But it's probably, I mean, in what we view or we saw in the slide, another possible implication of thinking very well how we define publicly available is not only the scope, the consistency of implementation, which is per se a harmonization that allows to work as a scientist in DSI in different sectors and jurisdictions. It's also the interoperability and the intercommunication, which leads to collaboration. So this is going to be like also helping in the numbers of scientists, researchers that are collaborating in different places and producing more DSI and consuming more DSI, but producing at the end more knowledge that could be also generate these benefits, monetary and non-monetary.
Thank you very much, Marta. So unencumbered, most interesting. So we'll be coming back. Thank you, and thank you, Mary. Please don't go anywhere. As you know, we have plenty of time and opportunity to discuss your ideas and for you to discuss others as well. So thanks again. Let's move to the next term, entity. I think the word entity appears, I may be wrong, but I think it appears 3 times in the decision in the context of national entity. And then there's another phrase, international, regional, or sub-regional entity. And finally, in a footnote, talks about host entity. The first 2 are in the context and probably where we're going to focus today of receiving and distributing funds. The third is the host entity refers to the MPTFO. And I don't think that likely poses problems for anyone, but maybe I'm wrong. So as we did in the first segment, we're going to turn to Sue-Ellen to let us know what the research, desktop research delivered. Thanks. Sue-Ellen?
Yes, thanks again. So indeed, concentrating on entity in relation to money in, and I mean we have it in relation to the 2 out of 3 thresholds, and then there's also the small, medium, and large entities. And it's really getting interesting if we look into the common meanings, where it is a broad term denotating any actor with a distinct and independent existence. What does that mean in the DSI context? Commonly, it includes companies, universities, research institutions, NGOs, public bodies, and state-owned enterprises in our context. And if we look at international practices, it's a broader term than company or legal person, more an umbrella term, and usually interpreted throughout a legal instrument unless it's otherwise specified. And of course, when we look at now 16.2, there's a potential ambiguity to the core question, not that much what an entity is, but what it constitutes as a relevant unit of responsibility for benefit sharing. So could it be an individual legal person, a subsidiary, a parent company, a holding, an entire corporate group, or parts thereof? I mean, that's not clear. And in that regard, of course, there are some possible implications in terms of expected contributions to the Cali Fund, from whom. And of course, when it comes to legal certainty, there is also a matter of consistency when it comes to implementation. Also, this just as framing for the discussion, and back to the moderator.
Thanks very much, Sue-Ellen. Well, let's see what our panelists make of this. As mentioned, Agatha is unable to join us today, but she has recorded some of her thoughts, and we'll start with Agatha's video, and then we'll move to both Daphne and Paul, where you'll have 3 minutes each, as others have. So please, Stephanie, could you roll the video, please?
My name is Agata Makowska-Karen, and it's a pleasure to contribute to this discussion. I'm an environmental economist, currently pursuing a PhD at the London School of Economics and the Grantham Research Institute, and I'm also a consultant to the CBD Secretariat, working on the Cali Fund revenue potential and contribution rates. I should also clarify that I'm speaking today in my academic capacity, and the views expressed are my own and do not represent the position of the CBD Secretariat or LSE. I'll try to be fast, given there are many speakers today, and I was asked to reflect on 2 terms, entity and direct-indirect use, found in the decision 16.2. I also want to be upfront that I'm not a lawyer, so what follows is an economics perspective on these terms rather than a legal analysis. and with no clear definition of what constitutes an entity, and similarly no official description of direct or indirect use of DSI, implementation may differ between contributing entities and across jurisdictions, and this is what I'll be capturing in my presentation today. So starting with an entity. Decision 16.2 gives no definition of what constitutes an entity, and for the purpose of my research, I take it to mean an individual legal entity, typically an operating for-profit company that's undertaking commercial activities. That is a working assumption rather than an official one, but the open question it leaves is important. Should the contributing entity be an individual subsidiary or maybe the consolidated corporate group? And that choice changes who actually pays and how much. So it cuts both ways. Subsidiary level assessment supports more accurate targeting, where firms contribute for their entities that potentially actually use DSI, rather than for a group that may have only a marginal connection to it. However, it also creates a minimization risk. DSI activity can be shifted into low revenue or low profit subsidiaries to shrink the contribution base, which is a pattern that's quite well documented in the corporate tax literature on intra-group profit shifting. However, given that participation is effectively voluntary, the more fundamental question may be whether firms engage at all. Under a non-binding scheme, non-participation is the path of least resistance, where eligible firms face no legal obligation to contribute, regardless of how their structure is assessed. So profit shifting and restructuring are strategies firms would only really need if reputational or policy pressure or any other kind of incentives are in place that makes their participation likely. And that is a broader question that my research addresses. To make this concrete, it helps to look at how large multinationals are actually structured. So here, look on the right-hand side on the diagram. A corporate group typically comprises a parent company and multiple subsidiaries operating across different sectors and countries. Under subsidiary level assessment, that group appears as multiple separate contributing entities, and under a group level assessment, it is a single entity. And each of those approaches has distinct implications. Group level assessment eliminates intra-group profit shifting, since internal transactions effectively net out when all subsidiaries are covered. But the restructuring risk does not disappear. It shifts to the group boundary itself. So a firm could spin off its DSI intensive R&D operations into a separate legal entity that sits outside the corporate group, or, for example, place that activity into a joint venture structure, which would effectively remove it from the scope without changing the underlying commercial activity that uses DSI. However, there's also a fairness concern. Assessing at group level means subsidiaries with no DSI connection contribute alongside those that do. On the other hand, consolidated financials are larger, making it easier for groups to meet the eligibility thresholds. Subsidiary level assessment is more targeted, but opens the door to revenue and profit shifting between subsidiaries to, for example, shrink the contribution base, and to restructuring that moves DSI activity into entities that fall below the thresholds. The minimization risk is real in both directions. It just takes a different form depending on the level of assessment. And this matters not just for revenue, but also for competitive fairness. Both the EU and the US use affiliation conditions in similar contexts, where they're treating entities under common ownership or control as a single unit, specifically to prevent large groups from restructuring into smaller units to avoid obligations such as higher taxes. The Cali Fund currently has no equivalent provision, and introducing a similar affiliation condition, for example, by defining contributing entities by reference to common ownership or control rather than purely by legal form, is one design option parties could consider as implementation progresses.
Thank you very much, Agatha, wherever you are. Very much appreciate your contribution, which was more than 3 minutes, but very informative. So over to you, Daphne, please. Thank you again for being here, and we look forward to hearing from you. Daphne?
Yeah, thank you very much, Tim. And that was an interesting introduction by Agatha. So I think I think it was very interesting opening on the point actually it was in the slides on the relevant unit of responsibility, and I think that's a very useful concept. And I'd like to start really by describing in a way the landscape of DSI use in companies. First of all, the extent of use of publicly available DSI is actually very diverse and obviously can change over time. So in large groups, it's probably quite rare that all their activities would use publicly available DSI. There might only be some of the individual companies or divisions in the group. And then in these individual companies, whether they're independent or part of a larger group, they might then use DSI in all their activities or just in some of their activities and just maybe in some of their divisions or product lines. So it's really quite diverse. So in the light of this reality, how can we ensure proportionality and relevance when implementing the modalities of benefit sharing on publicly available DSI, as Agatha said, to address this fairness concern? So there was prompt to look at maybe the language of the decision to see if that can help us. Paragraph 2 says that all users of DSI on genetic resources under the multilateral mechanism should share benefits arising from its use in a fair and equitable manner. So basically, this implies that sharing benefits presupposes giving a portion of the benefits created from publicly available DSI. So this is not a technical detail, it actually goes to the rationale of the mechanism, which is sharing of benefits created. So we say if we have a pizza, a Four Seasons pizza with 4 different like artichokes, mushrooms, ham and cheese, for instance, and only the artichokes are let's say equivalent to the benefits arising from publicly available DSI. If you take a slice, sort of predetermined slice of the whole pizza, that'll be very, very different from a predetermined percentage or slice of just the artichoke section. So if you apply that to companies, that there is a concern really that the percentages currently expected in the decision would apply to a whole range of activities that have nothing to do with DSI or even genetic resources, and so would not really be proportionate. So I would say the entity really needs to be interpreted in a way that contribution expectations fairly represent a share of the benefits arising from the use of publicly available DSI. Having said that, it's also important to take into account how publicly available DSI is used in the research process, because while its exact use will vary according to the type of research, this type of DSI is generally used as a tool. I think I've come to the end of my 3 minutes. Just want to quickly say that it's the implications are that if benefit sharing is not proportionate, it could deter investments in this type of innovation and the competitiveness of bio-based products and solutions, as it would make them too expensive to develop and commercialize. So I think that's a very important kind of real life impact that has to be taken into account. Yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daphne. Proportionality and fairness. Yes. Thank you. I think it was very clear. I appreciate it. Now let's move to Paul. Dr. Oldham, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Tim. Thanks to Daphne for making us all hungry by talking about pizza. And I'm just going to kind of agree with Agatha in essence. I mean, when we were working on what became the LSE Roundtable on DSI, we started to use the term entities because it has the advantage of being both neutral and flexible. So, and it doesn't prejudge what the COP may determine about a particular contributing entity. So I think the challenge, as Agatha is really pointing out, is the reality of the diversity of forms and scales of companies. And that is leading to the kind of discussions we're starting to see now around topics such as the intensity of the use of DSI, and in particular, I think the issue of proportionality of company contributions to the Cali Fund, which is linked to questions of fairness. I think there are some, in addition to what Agatha and Daphne were talking about, I think there are some tools that can help us a little bit with disentangling some of this, particularly tools at the UN level. One of those is the system of national accounts, which sets the international standard for economic reporting. There's something I would call the most boring paper I have ever written, called the Cali Fund Sectors, Products and Services, that goes into detail on this. But what's interesting about the system of national accounts for our purposes is the way it describes enterprises and corporations. So to paraphrase it, the majority of enterprises engage in only one sort of production, but the majority of production is carried out by a relatively small number of large corporations that undertake many different kinds of production, which goes exactly to what Agatha was talking about, and also to what Daphne was talking about. Now, to address this, the system of national accounts talks about an establishment as an entity that's engaged in a single location, that's engaged mainly in a single form of production. That could be something like enzymes or chemicals, that then leads through to classifications of different kinds of products and systems of national reporting. But I think the challenge really is that we will have kind of units of production, companies that are engaged in single kinds of production, and then we will have these much larger structures, such as groups, as Agatha is pointing out, and those are more challenging to deal with. And I think one of the topics that came up for the LSE roundtable was the difficulty of valuation of DSI as causing quite a lot of problems. I think the issue that's coming up now is this issue of proportionality when we look at the way the world, in terms of corporate structures, actually works. And I think one way to approach this is not so much in terms of definitions, but in terms of tools that might be used by companies to understand the way in which they use DSI. So in the case, for example, of GDPR in the EU and the UK, decision tree models are provided for companies such as mine in understanding what their obligations are in relation to GDPR. The same is true, I think, for the EU REACH legislation. And we could imagine the development of these kinds of decision tree tools that would allow companies to understand internally what the nature of their utilization of DSI is. However, taking into account precisely the point that Agatha was making about shifting to a lower level subsidiary in order to avoid contribution. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Again, much appreciate your insights and your untangling approach. Very useful. So now let's move to the next term. And we've asked Pierre and Hugo to say a few words on this next term. And but before we do that, let's again move to Suel to share with us some of the results of the research we've done on this next term. Suel, you have the floor.
All right. So indicative rates also seem to be seen to some way a challenge, as as we heard from a couple of stakeholders, and so let's have a look what the common meanings reflect. So a suggested or reference level rate, rather providing guidance on a magnitude and not an obligation. And looking now into the international practice in the United Nations, OECD, we we see it that it functions sometimes as benchmarks or planning tools, as a non-binding reference used for guidance, calibration, or negotiation, and is often intended to shape kind of expectations. Now, in relation to the MLM and the Cali Fund 16.2, the key question probably is whether it can be seen as purely illustrative or is it a normative benchmark? And that's of course relevant when it comes to the certificate and obtaining a certificate. In other words, if I was under the indicative rate, would it still be worth to obtain a certificate? And in the same sense, do they influence expectations for contributions? And also these indicative rates, to what extent are they flexible over time? It may influence expectations regarding contribution levels, even if it's not formally binding, this indicative. And of course, different interpretations may affect then the predictability of what's in the fund and the consistency of contribution practices. So once again, I hope some ammunition for further discussion.
Thank you very much, Suel. Actually, I realized that not that we were meant to discuss this, but the word indicative is used in several contexts in the decision, in the context of the list of sectors, an indicative list of sectors, and also indicative list of criteria. So it's quite commonly used through decision, but here we're focusing on rate, indicative rate. Let's start with you, Pierre, please. You have 3 minutes or so to share some of your first reflections.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Well, yes, I mean, I think that the whole point of having it as an indicative rate was because it was an in-principle agreement that, there needs to be this operationalized multilateral mechanism, not only to share benefits, but to change the way that we relate to the businesses that benefit from biodiversity contributing to the conservation of biodiversity. And so, of course, an indicative rate is for further discussions for the operationalization of the mechanism, and it does indeed set expectations, but it's not a legally binding provision that applies at all levels. I mean, for example, where a country passes national legislation to oblige benefit sharing from the use of DSI, it can set its own rate. It can also, of course, negotiate its own rate in a bilateral arrangement where it deals with DSI from its resources that do not form part, of the publicly available international data set. What occurs to me is, and thank you for mentioning that indicative, is in fact mentioned it in other places in the text, but what occurs to me is that it's really important, the decision itself as an indication of changing the free riding on biodiversity system. I have some observations around publicly available, which I'll contribute in the future on. But in this case, I think this is so that we have a floor. I don't think this is a ceiling. This is a floor for further discussions. It definitely will something that should be taken into account at COP18 in the revision of the effectiveness of this mechanism. Is this rate mobilizing the amount of funding that could reasonably be expected? And is it not mobilizing it because it's too high or it's too low? having said that, I do think that the biggest mistake that COP16/2 made was to make the baseline for contributions to the multilateral mechanism far too narrow, by limiting it only to big entities, and not going further down the value chain and spreading the load over a far bigger sector of the economy and of humanity, because ultimately all of us are dependent on biodiversity for not only for our businesses but for our very lives. I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Hugo, please.
Yes, thank you. I hope you can hear me now. I come as presented and introduced to this panel from a background as a negotiator and regulator in a global north context, which means I spent years on one side of these ABS debates, trying to understand what industry could live with and what it could not, and trying to translate that into text that provider countries and civil society could also accept. And I have comments on all four terms, as Pierre, especially against the background that I have now been supporting the CBD Secretariat into drafting an evaluation methodology for the MLF for discussion and adoption at COP15. So my lens is, in principle, which interpretation makes the mechanism work, which interpretation generates contribution flows it needs to be credible, and which gives business the legal certainty without which the voluntary participation, which is mandated by Decision 16.2, will not happen. So I think it's right by the organizers to focus on the term indicative. Tim, you're right. There is an indicative sector list and indicative allocation criteria, but those two do not pose any issues. It's right that indicative contribution rates could pose a problem, and it's among those things where, as a negotiator, I would say, well, I wish one would have not used that word. But I think from my perspective, clearly there are two interpretations. The broad interpretation that Suel has actually presented, which means it's just a reference point that can be adjusted up or down depending on the company's self-assessment, DSI use intensity, and therefore the contribution amount may be variable. And I think because of the link between the contribution rate and the certificate issue, is not really workable. Because if you apply that broad interpretation of indicative, the rates are completely variable, and there is no legal certainty that the contributor has met its obligation. And the regulator, the national jurisdiction, cannot legislate national measures around a non-fixed benchmark. And I think that from that perspective, it would be, I think, logical from the structure of the decision to go for a narrow interpretation, because indicative in UN language as well, I've looked at that a little bit, can actually mean a fixed provisional rate operative until COP17 reviews. Because let's not forget, the indicative rate is complemented by an obligation for COP17 to review that and take a decision. And the language doesn't say may take a decision, it actually says it has to take a decision. And that was against the background that negotiators really knew in the night when this decision was finally finalized, that they were on very thin ice with regard to the level of contributions, the contribution rate that was mentioned in the decision. And therefore, it is provisional, but it's not variable in the interpretation that one has to make when you compare it to, and you link it to the certificate provision, it's paragraph 15, but also to the provision that there has to be another decision at COP17. And here I have to respectfully disagree with Pierre. It can go up, it can also go down, because I think there are a lot of claims to saying that in some respects those rates are too high. I don't go into that discussion at this point in time. So I think something that is clearly needed is to by CBD COP, and there is an opportunity at COP17 to replace the word indicative with something specific in that regard. So I'll stop here. I see Stefan has come online. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Hugo. Visional, variable. Okay, not variable. Right. So, you and all the panelists will have very shortly a chance to widen the discussion beyond beyond your first examination of your first terms. Looking forward to that very much. Now we're going to move to the terms direct and indirect. I think that they appear about 3 or 4 times in the decision, both in the context of benefits and use, as I recall. I think it's the latter context that appears to be generating the concern, from what I've heard from a range of people dealing with this decision. Enough from me, though. Let's go to Sewell and see what he's got for us. Sewell, please.
Yes, thanks a lot. And let's get to my favorite and maybe the most sticky one. It's then this differentiation between direct and indirect use. And as you rightly said, I mean, it is related to the benefits to be shared, as we see. Here it's in relation to sectors. And then it's also on entities that are active in sectors, be it directly or indirectly. So in the common meanings, direct would rather refer to immediate use or benefit, whereas indirect is rather related to mediated or downstream effects. At least in the dictionaries we found something about it. In international practice, generally speaking, also here, the treaty, UNESCO, they recognize that benefits may arise through multiple actors and forms of application, and this question of downstream has not really been resolved by either of them. So in interpretation of indirect in other contexts, for example, when it comes to cartels and antitrust, there is a notion, of course, of foreseeability and proximate effects. When we look at tax, anti-money laundering, indirect, there is still a link to traceability through ownership and control chains. And in relation to supply chain management, environmental social governance, it is still defined in relation to upstream and downstream relationships. Looking now at 16.2, the boundaries between direct and indirect use are not defined, and there's also no limit to causation or attribution. And so the key question that arises is, of course, how far does indirect extend? Yeah? Is it then on the identifiable value chain only, or does it include also more remote contributions, where DSI forms one of many inputs, applications, and value additions? For example, if it's used just as reference data. And when thinking about possible implications, it's again on scope covered in terms of use and actors that may vary depending on the interpretation of the word indirect, and there are significant differences in how terms direct and indirect use benefit are typically interpreted in the sectors that are mentioned in the annex. So in consequence, users may be uncertain in determining whether and how their activities relate or do not relate to the mechanism. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sewell. As again, very interesting and a good basis for further discussion, including from our next 2 panelists to speak. We're going to go back to some video from Agatha, and then to you, Daphne, And in terms of the fairness and maybe even proportionality, I must apologize to all the panelists. As you heard, Agatha seems to have taken more than her 3 minutes allotted, and perhaps she was unclear about it. So our intention is not to unduly restrict everybody else. I think we're going to have enough time for you. I certainly hope so, and that is our intention. Stefan, can you please roll the video?
I'll turn now to direct and indirect use, which I think is the area where the current wording creates the most genuine uncertainty and where industry concerns are, in my view, legitimate. So in standard value chain analysis, direct use refers to a firm that engages with the value generating input itself, in this case, DSI. Indirect use refers to downstream firms that benefit commercially from outputs derived from that input without working with it directly. So, read broadly, the inclusion of indirect users in Decision 16.2 could extend eligibility well beyond any firm with a meaningful connection to DSI, which is clearly not what was intended, but the text as written does not rule it out. And let me give you a couple of concrete scenarios that illustrate why this matters. So first, we have the first case. There is the laboratory equipment, which is the clearest boundary problem. Lab equipment manufacturers sit upstream, not downstream, of the firms using their tools. Typically here, I'm just using an example of pharma and biotech companies. Lab equipment is explicitly listed as an Enclosure 1 sector, so it stays captured regardless of how indirect is defined. But this creates a pass-through risk similar to what we observe with VAT taxes. An upstream contributor with a direct value chain linked to other Enclosure 1 sectors could, in theory, pass on the cost of its own contribution to downstream pharma and biotech firms, who would then effectively pay twice for the same underlying DSI use. Whether this kind of pass-through actually occurs in practice is uncertain, since it depends on market structure and pricing power, but the structural possibility exists. And second, a more extreme version of the same problem, if a firm sells a DSI-derived product, an enzyme, or an additive, does that make its purchaser liable as an indirect beneficiary simply because the product they bought used DSI? This is a stretch, and I don't think it reflects the intent of the decision, but it's exactly the kind of reading the current wording does not foreclose. Without additional definition, indirect could be interpreted as reaching any actor downstream in the value chain, which would be unworkable. And finally, so where does this leave us? I don't think there is an easy answer, but I would point to 3 options. The simplest fix is to either remove indirect from the text entirely or define it narrowly. It is worth asking what indirect use was actually meant to capture. If the answer is lab equipment specifically, that sector is already explicitly listed in Enclosure 1, so it would remain captured even without the word indirect doing any work. That would narrow the scope considerably without losing the cases the parties likely had in mind. The harder problem is the pass-through and stacking risk I described. For example, lab equipment to its downstream users. In principle, a VAT-style mechanism could let contributing firms deduct the passed-on cost of an upstream provider's contribution. However, in practice, I believe this is administratively demanding and possibly impossible to track reliably, partly because, unlike VAT, we don't have good visibility into the value added from DSI use at each stage of a given value chain. And then finally, the third option, sector definitions alone, which is one option that has been raised, can help limit who's in scope, but they don't resolve where along the value chain liability actually attaches. There is also a prior mapping problem. Translating the Enclosure 1 sectors into standard industrial classification frameworks such as ISIC or NACE is already imprecise for some sectors, which is something I have come across in my work. For example, nutraceuticals is one of those examples where we cannot match them easily. This means that the boundaries of who's in scope at all remain contested even before the indirect question arises. So I believe that any workable solutions will likely need to combine clear sector definitions with some additional criterion for where in the value chain the obligation attaches. What the boundary should be is ultimately a political question, and I don't think it can be fully resolved before COP17, but even limited progress on a small number of clear boundary cases, the lab equipment pass-through issue being the obvious candidate, would give companies and parties a firmer basis to work from as implementation continues.
Thank you very much, Agatha. Perhaps if we have an opportunity, Paul, for you to consider Agatha's points about mapping on from ISIC and NACE, so industrial codes standpoint, if we have time, later on. We'll turn to Daphne, and Daphne, we won't press you on 3 minutes, so please feel free to expand. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thanks so much, Tim. Yeah, I mean, I think that Agatha, I agree with most of what Agatha said. Just add that in addition to the challenges that she raised, there is also the reality that bio-based solutions and products are competing with products developed with through other kinds of solutions, say fossil fuel-based solutions, chemical solutions, and that having this additional encumbrance of benefit sharing expectations on a product that would be presented to your client, i.e., if you sell your product to your client, the client would then have to also be expected to share benefits. That would very clearly place that your product, which is bio-based, at a competitive disadvantage to a potential competitor's product, which is not bio-based. So to be considered, so for the level playing field across different sectors, that is a problem. And obviously, you know, we have to also ask what the overall objective is in the kind of the transition, sustainability transition. Agatha mentioned, I think, 3 options. Option 2, I think, on having a similar system to VAT, where you kind of remove at each stage the VAT from that stage, sounds rather very complicated, and I would say would produce a lot of administrative complexity and costs, so probably not a good idea. And I think she already raised a lot of problems with the third option that she proposed. So option 1, I think removing indirect would probably really be the simplest in clearing up this confusion. Yeah, so I would agree with her on that. Yeah, I think actually Agatha covered a lot of things I wanted to say, so thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Daphne. When in doubt, take it out, is what I've heard you say, as Agatha as well. In some cases, of course, that does work quite well. Now, my apologies, Julian, but please, we're in your hands. Over to you.
No worries, man. When in doubt, take it out. Is that come in the negotiator's handbook from back in the day?
It ought to if it doesn't. It ought to if it doesn't.
Okay, great. Well, fascinating start as we expected. Everybody, there's so much to talk about here. Let's see here. I do want to give everybody a chance just to add another comment, and I'll prompt you. But of course, you're free to answer the question that you wish rather than the one that I'm going to answer. I will note there's a couple of sort of general perspectives that are out there. You know, Suad is making reference to the notion that the point of all this and the driving force of all this should be equitable access for the use of DSI, and therefore, you know, maybe tech transfer becomes more important, and we might get lost on some of the details, but fundamentally, this mechanism should be contributing to increasing the capacity of those around the world to use DSI. So that's an interesting one, a general one that I'll leave you with and let you respond to. And Maui's provocation before he left was pretty interesting too, about how much do we need definitions if we can ensure that at least the spirit of the mechanism is being fulfilled. Of course, right now, as somebody else pointed out, there's not a lot of funds in the fund yet. And I think actually precisely it's because people are hesitating based on these some of the ambiguities that are built into the system. But let's start with publicly available. Marta, I'm afraid you're the only one left here, although others will be free to comment on this as well in the third round. But I am curious about the tension between access, unencumbered access, and sort of license structure and requirements that some databases might use. You know, there are questions about where where the line between licenses and restrictions come across publicly available. On the one hand, and I wonder if you have thoughts on that. And on the other, there are comments also about where exactly the sort of in the language of the decision, there's conversation about national restrictions and where they apply. So I wonder if you have a sense of those two things. First, like where this line is between acceptable license requirements are, and then where open access are, and then the other piece is how do countries and national legislation play into this? Go ahead.
Well, from experience, Julian, the first one is basically the point of access, right? It's a matter of when in the value chain I have the restrictions. I cannot have it in the access to the sequences, because if I have those restrictions there, operationally, logistically, even computationally, it's going to be a real hurdle. So the value chain of the research is not going to go to a good end. It's not going to go to produce knowledge that may produce the monetary benefits. It is producing already non-monetary benefits. And for the second one, the relation will be is exactly when and where I have this sort of not restriction, but information added on this metadata of when, where, who is putting it. So if I can, in the publicly available database, include this type of information, it's going to be, of course, what is the compliance, right? It's the compliance. Now, when I put it publicly, it constitutes like the information in the prior art. So if I can go as far as after in this value chain, that mind that it's not only one stakeholder, it could be many stakeholders, comes to commercialization at the end. Of course, it has already been publicly stated, right, in the prior art, and it has where, who, from where. So I think that the part that we saw in the slide about national regulation where applicable, I think it's like that. The wording is similar. It's exactly that. It's the country's rules, right? That it's subjecting me to understand how I deal before even sequencing. It's just at the very beginning.
Okay, great. Thanks, Marta. And Ugo, I saw you trying to get in there. You have a contribution on the data side?
Yeah, thank you. And very interesting conversation. I think that from the perspective of somebody who's been sitting through all these discussions over the years, there has always been the understanding that what is meant by publicly available is something that is available to the public, and the accessibility is not subject to discretion by the database operator. So I would agree with what has been said, that there may be a registration requirement, there may be a paywall, even that, but there cannot be a discretionary decision by the database owner to give access to one and not give access to the other. So there has been an equal opportunity in that regard. I think that also a very clear understanding is that publicly available means when it's on the database, it doesn't carry with it any obligations additional to the ones that are sort of with regard to the access to the data sequence, and which may be carried under the DSI decision in that regard. So national legislation only comes in as a gatekeeper. If there are further going national limitations, the data should not be on a publicly available database. So that is a crucial element with regard to legal certainty. If you get access to this database by whatever means, being completely open access or through a paywall or through something else, you have the right to use it, and there are no further reaching obligations, even sort of linked to possible national legislation. If a country wants to have further limitations, those data should not be on databases. That would be sort of in that regard, a rather broad definition of publicly available that should encompass a lot of proprietary databases as well. So broaden the contribution base in that regard. Thank you.
Okay. Great. So interesting, Hugo, because what you're making me think about is that in the non-discriminatory sense, that is a nice way to contrast it from a private database where the owner has discretion over how and who uses the data, as opposed to something public where so long as the rules are clear, anybody, even with a paywall, could access it so long as I pay. That's an interesting distinction. Okay, let's do one more on the data, and then we'll move on to the next one. Pierre, what's on your mind?
Yeah, I mean, first let me agree with Hugo. I mean, it was also my understanding, right, is that what publicly available means is that it's up on a database and pretty much anyone with an internet connection could download it and use it without restriction in theory. And I would then like to recall that this was brought into the text of 16/2 very last minute in plenary at adoption, right? And it was brought in by parties who felt that they needed to double tie the bow on their sovereign right to control resources and data from resources that are not yet publicly available in open access databases. So they were doing this because they didn't trust the United Nations to protect their sovereign rights, and they were saying, well, the multilateral mechanism only applies to that data that is publicly available. Right. So it's important to remember that. But I would also argue that nobody who uses DSI today, right, could ever have used that DSI if it was not for the publicly available data. The whole industry as we know it today was built up on the basis of open access to data. At a time when sequencing was extremely expensive and it made no sense to go and duplicate sequencing, it was done already. Scientists between them agreed to share data and to concentrate on sequencing other things and learning from that. So anyone who argues today that, oh, I don't use INSDC data, I only use my private data, and never mind the FT copies of all the relevant INSDC stuff that I've been downloading for years and is now in my private collection, this is wrong. That's disingenuous, right? I mean, you would not have had that if you did not have publicly available data. So all users of DSI use publicly available data. At least they use it indirectly. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Okay, thanks, Pierre. And I do want to note something in the chat about why are we mentioning other international fora. We will mention those, of course, in future webinars. We can't touch them all in each webinar, and I know that discussing things in isolation is a little bit artificial, but it's also very difficult to talk about everything all at once. So I promise you we'll get to some of those in the near future. Okay, so lots to talk about still in terms of the publicly available. I still have questions about where licensing and restrictions on use, even through open access, can come into play. But we'll come back to those. I do want to ask about entity. Let's move on a little bit there. And the thing about 16.2 is that my sense is that it was trying to be all-encompassing and make things as simple and as uniform as possible for all possible contributors. However, simplicity doesn't often play terribly well with proportionality or with sort of custom right-sized approaches for each and every kinds of use. So I am wondering two things. One, is entity the kind of is it a way to solve the problem of proportionality because we can look down at more sort of specific subsidiary, sub-corporate levels? And if so, does that then require more disclosure on the part of the companies who are claiming that, only a small part of my use comes from this particular portion of my corporate entity? So, Paul and Daphne, I'll put that one to you. And the second one I want to put to you guys is there is language in 16.2 that talks about the need to look at products and services modalities. Is entity something that can be used to address that? In other words, if I have a small entity within my corporation that is looking that only uses DSI for specific products or services, is entity the way out there? Is that how I can account for that and make it somewhat more proportional. So let me give the floor to Daphne and Paul first, and then Hugo, I'll hand it over to you. Go ahead, Daphne.
Yeah, so just to the second question about products and services, I'm not sure if entity would entirely, of the interpretation of entity would entirely address the problem, because you would have perhaps you would have an entity, a business division, or a company where only maybe one line of products services maybe actually using DSI or genetic, is bio-based at all. In fact, for instance, if you have a big petrochemical company and they're starting to move into more bio-based solutions, you could just have, one small unit doing that. So entity may not completely resolve the problem. However, if you look at maybe there are other terms in there that could maybe be used if you apply with the concept of relevance. There's turnover, there's profit. I mean, if you think that, relevant turnover or relevant profit, that could be a way of doing it also. I mean, I do realize that, there's always this balance between simplicity and fairness because it's an international agreement, right? With covering the whole world and all sectors in the world. So inevitably, there's a lot of diversity. So there is that balance to be found. In the second point, yes, on disclosure. Yeah, I mean, I can clearly see that countries would want more kind of want more evidence in a way of how companies assess the way they interpret some of the terms as applying them to their own activities. We have to be careful, though, that a lot of information that's not publicly disclosed is not publicly disclosed because precisely they're commercially sensitive and they don't want the competitors to see it. So, yeah, so I think that there's that big consideration to take into account.
So there's another tension, though, isn't there? Because on the one hand, I want to say, well, you should pay for what you use, and then somebody might say, well, I don't use that much, and so then the next question is, okay, well, can you show me how I would know whether you are or aren't using that much? And then, I mean, I understand that for business reasons, you may not want to disclose things. Maybe there's competitiveness issues. Maybe you're sharing costs in ways that you don't necessarily want people to know within your organization. So it's a bit of a tricky dilemma, isn't it, Daphne?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Paul, any thoughts on this one? You got anything that'll help us crawl out of this dilemma?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see a problem with the term entity, and I think that the term entity is pretty helpful. When it draws our attention to, the diversity of companies and their structures and their dynamic nature. What I will say is that one of the things that I think we're dealing with is the consequences of particular choices. So, a strong preference was expressed for not pursuing whatever track and trace style of options may be. And that gives you other kinds of choices. So what we do know is that UN member states have established elaborate classification systems by industrial sector, by products, and so on. Those are regularly revised in an open and transparent way, and I think those are pretty helpful, actually, and they fit in with standard economic reporting requirements. So, for example, in the case of the EU for the Prodcom survey from 2024, which is community production manufacturing, which is done anonymously, so you don't disclose the company, but they are required to report. So sales of heterocyclic compounds and nucleic acids in 2024 were 4.2 billion euros. The challenge, I think, there is that while we know that nucleic acids are in there as part and parcel of those statistics, is it's not discriminated further. So we don't know what percentage of something is of EU production is nucleic acids. However, having said that, I mean, it is open to UN member states and, of course, individual states to actually say we want to see a greater level of detail in reporting on X or Y.
Yeah.
So that's certainly a possibility that's open. But the final thing I would say is there are other forms of classification which again are controlled by parties, such as the patent system. So the patent system is much, much more detailed in its technical classification of areas of activity. And we see large-scale activity in relation to DSI that is also incredibly dynamic in terms of the companies
So let me just
involved.
understand that, Paul. You're saying that the patent classification is more detailed and maybe more DSI appropriate than the ISIC divisions? Because I got that pointed out that the ISICs were somewhat limited when you're looking for DSI. You're saying the patent side is actually more easily fitted to DSI research?
Yeah, just to clarify that they're actually trying to do different things. So really, the ISIC is classifying establishments by their type of economic production, and that is linked then to classifications of products and to a certain degree to services. The patent system, on the other hand, is classifying the technical nature of intellectual property objects that are a result of research and development. So they're doing separate things, but one of them, the patent classification, is a lot more detailed because that's quite deliberate. So I think the point here is there, in terms of tightening sector definitions, as Agatha was mentioning, the range of tools available to do that are in the control of governments. There's the question, though, of how far you can get with that, and whether you need to actually accept a certain degree of crudeness, because otherwise we kind of lurch back to whatever people imagine the track and trace approaches are. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. All right, Hugo, we'll get you a minute on this one, then we'll move on to the next.
Thank you. I would agree with Paul that in his initial statement that entities isn't really a big problem in that regard. Historical reference, I do recall why entities came into the text, at least in my recollection, because somebody came and said, not all those who make commercial use of DSI may be companies. There may be other entities doing that. So can we actually use a broader term? So that's my historical recollection. Now it's interesting to see that this leads to a lot of soul searching and analysis. My take on this is when you put entities together with indirect or direct use, put it together with the indicative list of sectors, you actually are steered towards a pretty good view of who could be added in that regard. Because I think through a clever use of the concept of indirect, you can actually circumvent some of this, or outsourcing that was actually explained could be the result of this. So I think that it's not so problematic as long as you don't see it as a term in itself, but you put it in the overall construct of 16.2 together with a list of sectors and with the understanding of indirect or direct, then one shouldn't have too much of a problem. And it goes back to a legal question that entity could be something that derives commercial benefit without being a company in that regard, which was one of the things that we discussed at the time of negotiation. Thank you.
Yeah, and I appreciate you, Hugo, starting to weave together the terms and seeing how they can work together to solve some of the problems that maybe they create separately. I actually think entities is a term that helps to clarify things, both because it can be more proportionate to and represent the sort of actual usage within a corporation and the subsidiary level, but also because I think maybe it can help to figure out how to deal with products and services, because maybe the entity within your company only makes that product that uses DSI, which was one of the arguments that we heard in 16.2, and I think definitely one of the things you were mentioning with regards to let's say the chemical company trying to move towards more biological processes. So I think entities is helpful, not the other way around, and certainly in combination with the other things, Hugo, becomes very interesting. And in fact, let me move to I want to relate that back to direct and indirect. So Agatha provoked us a little bit by suggesting that maybe we could just take out indirect and take out direct and indirect and rely more on this product classification or business classification, whether it be economic or through an object in the patent system. I wonder, panel, what your reaction to that is, to her provocation. Is actually, did we go too far in 16.2 in stating direct and indirect? If we take those out and we just have use, does that actually clarify or does it obfuscate? And let's see here. On direct and indirect, I think, Daphne, maybe you were on that one. Let me start with you if you don't mind. I wonder what you think about Agatha's notion of taking out direct and indirect and looking more at the sector list and refining the sector list.
Yeah, I think I already sort of mentioned that the whole concept of indirect is challenging if it implies the obligations going up the value chain, down the value chain. That might be simpler just to remove it or clarify it in a way that that removes that possibility. And sorry, your second question was. Sorry.
That's primarily it. About, if we take out direct and indirect, do we
Oh yeah, the sector.
we gain something?
Sorry,
And
the
yeah,
sector
then can we
point.
use the sector
Yeah,
list,
that's
right?
right. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. I think the sector. Yeah, I think that I think the mechanism is really grounded on the trigger of use, right? In this case, I think we're saying that it should be just the company itself using the DSI, whereas I think in most sectors, I mean, depending how narrowly they're defined, I guess, a lot of the companies or some of the companies, at least in those sectors, may not be using DSI in that way. So the sector approach also, I think, has got to be sort of carefully handled in the sense, and not necessarily presuming that every single company in the sector will be directly using DSI.
Right.
Yeah. So that's my maybe caution about the sectoral approach.
Indeed. There's no perfect approach. It seems like we need a few different approaches to cross-reference how to figure out who's using and what a proportionate contribution might be. So Hugo, I see your hand up again. I'll pass it back to you. And I wonder if you could also, when you get in there, just weave together for us again the way that the interdependence among these terms gets us more clarity, rather than looking at them in isolation. Go right ahead.
Yeah. I think that unfortunately the term, that the sentence that was said a couple of minutes ago, if in doubt, take it out, doesn't apply to multilateral negotiation. It's actually the opposite. If in doubt, take additional words in. And I think that is the origin of some of the problems that we're addressing here. I think that really a formulation like directly or indirectly has to be read in the sense that drafters were thinking of and something that was an active and purposeful use, even that is not done by the entity, but going back to that work itself. And I don't think that we can extend it to passive downstream benefit. So I think that's an important reflection that we should make. What was the legislative intent?
Can you say it again, Hugo? I'm not sure I completely understand. So the reason you can't extend that upstream or downstream is what?
No, it can be extended when you say directly or indirectly. It means there has to be some type of active, purposeful activity related to the use of DSI, which is not in the case in the downstream benefit, but it's certainly the upstream benefit.
Okay, so I buy a product that you made with DSI. That doesn't put my company that's not really a DSI user on the hook for contributions to the system, just because I bought your product.
If I outsource, if I use the action by somebody else to develop something without actually using a DSI myself, then I think we're getting into the realm of indirect benefit in that regard.
I see.
Which actually means you can go upstream, but you can't really go downstream after the product development. So
Okay.
so I think it is also again from a regulatory design perspective, I think you have to establish a legally manageable boundary somewhere because it's unenforceable. So I think that needs to be
Right.
in there
Okay.
from that perspective. And again, I think, as you said, the list of sectors together with the concept of entity and the understanding of the term directly or indirectly should be the basis of a workable definition. The workable definition is, from my perspective, what actually gives legal clarity to the entities, which actually
Okay.
makes them want to contribute. Because let's not forget, for whatever people may have wished for, this is a system that is based on the voluntary contribution by
Yeah.
entities that
Yeah.
actually want to obtain a certificate in that regard.
Right.
So I think
Right.
that's how it all works together. Thank you.
Okay. Great. Great. And I'm going to hand it back over to you, Tim, but I do want to note that that last piece that Hugo said about then obtaining the certificate probably does take us back to the indicative rates conversation, especially if you interpret it as provisional and non-variable, as Hugo suggested, though I think there may be some conversation about that as well. Thanks, everybody. I think we have one final opportunity for views from our panelists. Tim, help me out here. How's the chat going?
The chat has been very active, remains very active, and we're going to go to colleagues who have been monitoring and digesting the chat. But I've had an opportunity with you facilitating, Julian, to have a look at it, and there's a number of fresh ideas and fresh thoughts that the panelists may want to consider. But just before handing it over to Sue and Carlos. I should note, Hugo, that the old adage of when in doubt, take it out refers to an approach of not putting in terminology that obfuscates the decision, or in the case of a binding instrument, the article. So it's meant to be a guide to avoid in fact, what in part we're facing here, which is a good number of ambiguities, but it's not always possible to take it out. And in fact, with regard to 16.2 and the process under the CBD at the moment, what I've seen is very, very constructive, because we're having mature discussions about how we clarify and calm discussions. And in fact, ultimately, I think there will be much more clarity and a greater success. So it just indicates the degree to which we actually have evolved in a very positive manner. Right. So as we've mentioned, we've been monitoring the chat, and this is a chance. So in round 3, for consideration of what a good number of people have contributed in the chat. I'm not sure how many we actually have online today, but I know that we had, I think it was up to 500 or 600 registrants. So there's a good number of people watching with a great deal of experience and an intellect. So let's go to Carlos and to Sue to see what you got.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Tim. Well, yeah, there are a lot of questions and comments, very interesting, around the chat. But we're only to share some of the general ideas and maybe some questions that might help us to keep on going on the discussion. So first of all, maybe on publicly available, that there's this question: how can the multilateral mechanisms ensure that the open access to databases translate into more equitable participation in innovation, particularly if patents, technological capabilities, and scientific infrastructure remains concentrated among a relative small number of actors. So how the mechanisms can be useful and help to make it fair and open in this regard. Also, there's a question. In other forums, the DSI in the public domain, what is the difference? Is it an issue? What's the public domain of the database? So also, if if we find the same data, same gene, same sequence in public databases and in private databases, it's better to look how easily you can access rather than the content. Thinking about the process, if there's the same information, how can we get into there? Also, data from publicly available open databases should automatically give it in the scope for the Cali Fund. The data from publicly available open databases should be automatically be included in the scope of the Cali Fund. And passing to the entity matter, is it relevant for the term entity whether or not it's legally required to have balance sheet or not? Also, parties already have access to public information from companies that could help towards clarifying some of the gray zones when we are tracking where value is generated and how much could be complicated for both parties and industry, private sector to make that kind of calculations. And the use of term indicative is the use of the term indicative a way of avoiding the challenge of justifying the rate? Just to start sharing some of the ideas on those two main topics. Also, there is mentioned a lot of doubts and suggestions about benefit sharing. Beyond benefit sharing, what type of collaboration do you think should be built with civil society to reduce inequalities in access to data technology? Thinking how can we open the space to be more inclusive and in a participation approach. And well, I'm going to pass the floor to Suhel to share some ideas on indicative rates and direct and indirect use.
Well, in order not to overburden now the panelists, maybe we'll just chew on what Carlos has detected and picked out, Tim, and then I would come with a second batch.
Thank you, Suel. I think it's a good idea that we segment a little bit. And thank you, Carlos. Obviously very rich and very packed set of ideas there. I'm proposing that that we open it up to the entire panel for reaction to one or more of the contributions that Carlos has reviewed with us, and there's more, of course, as well. And yeah, and just put your hand up when you're ready to make a contribution. Please, panel. Pierre, let's start with you, please. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Well, it responds to a few of the points that Carlos picked up, but I mean, I think the sort of headline of him is what is fair and equitable, and what is fair and equitable in terms of capacity and access and ability to use DSI. And the MLM has provisions for non-monetary benefit sharing. It has thoughts on capacity development. There's a more general commitment to capacity development under the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol and the Cartagena Protocol, of course. But the MLM really was designed to share benefits from the use of DSI. It was not designed to solve every problem of the world. And to the extent to which it can ensure fairness and equity is not really governed by the mechanism for collecting money and paying that money out to look after biodiversity and its sustainable use and conservation and the people who look after the biodiversity. So yes, it is very much a concern that, for example, Africa does not have a lot of capacity to use its own DSI or global DSI, but that issue is not something that the MLM was designed to solve, right? I mean, while it's a problem, it's not a problem of the implementation of the Cali Fund. It's something that needs to be addressed in parallel and in a complementary way. So to expect that the MLM will solve all of the problems of development and of biodiversity all at the same time is completely unrealistic. But if it was to focus on what it was designed to do, which was to gather resources from those who benefit from the use of biodiversity, including through the use of digital sequence information that is publicly available, and channel some of those resources towards the conservation of biodiversity, and go some way towards filling that $200 billion funding gap that is holding us back. Right? That, I think, should be enough for the MLM. Right? That would not necessarily guarantee fairness and equity. We need to do other things to guarantee fairness and equity, and many of those things, in fact, might not be amenable to being solved through a multilateral mechanism, and would need to be solved through a bilateral approach to all of the resources that have not been sequenced yet, and therefore are still under sovereign national control. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Pierre. Before we go to Suel, I do see that the Article 10 of the Nagoya Protocol has been raised in the chat, and I'm not proposing that we go into discussion of its viability or usefulness in the context of DSI for GRs, but I know, Pierre, that you will have some thoughts on that, I'm sure, as being closely involved in the negotiation of that final text, as was I as a co-chair of that negotiation. Quite interesting. I also noticed that we've got, and maybe Suel, you're about to pick this up, but there was some ideas emerging that maybe the certificate of compliance could actually be quite helpful. And in fact, I suppose that Paul might actually want to intervene on that. But let's go to you, Suel, please.
Yeah, I don't want to come now with a whole machine gun of aspects and just pick out maybe two of different, let's say, orders of magnitude. So the first one is when it comes to direct and indirect, and whether or not also some monitoring and tracking of IP would be helpful, because statement was made that little of the use of DSI will be commercially successful, but almost all are enjoying some sort of intellectual property. So could also making use of application of IP be a way out, and that also may then relate to some said that this indicative list of sectors would be too narrow, and biotechnology is pretty broad, and so would we need to have a look at this indicative list of sectors, and could in that relation, for example, IP be the solution. The other more broader thing is that there was a lot of discussion on trust and how can we build trust, and some say that for building trust, clarity and certainty is key, and in particular for industry, so that in that regard, the certificate of compliance is a must-have, and that it should be simplified and maybe also product specific, and must automatically provide global clearance, also on avoiding stacking and overlapping parallel claims. And it was also suggested that maybe Paul, as a first contributor, should share some views on what the certificate should basically entail, and whether also that could be gradually then enlarged, what a certificate could entail. I think with that we have a lot to chew on.
Thank you very much, Suel. It was very succinct and wide-ranging. Exercising some discretion here, I think, Julian, your idea that we ask all the panelists who would wish to take the floor one last time to maybe circle back to some of their or highlight some of their original thoughts, and or reflect on what we've heard through the chat and through other panelists. So and maybe a minute or two each, and then in fact a minute each, and then we will have to conclude. So let's do that, and thank you for the idea, Julian. Let's start with Marta. Marta, please.
Yes, it does resonate with me. First of all, there's no trust without willingness, right? So we have to go for a simple, elegant solution. And when you talk about IP, it comes to mind what I said before. With the open access, publicly available databases, the right metadata, it becomes part of this prior art. So the moment I come with the IP, right, I can try to elucidate where the benefits are coming, and of course the contributions, and identify hopefully well the entities, and of course go towards the goal that we have, that it's like strengthening the Cali Fund to achieve what we need, that it's biodiversity conservation.
Thank you very much, Melta. Ugo, please.
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Because there's a confusing message on my screen. Okay. Very briefly, I think that I agree with Pierre that the Cali Fund or the Multilateral Mechanism cannot solve all the issues around ABS and DSI. It's designed to do a specific thing in the sense that it's designed to provide additional financial resources for capacity building and for benefit sharing from the use of DSI. And for that, I think the multilateral mechanism needs a couple of additional decisions being taken at the COP17, after which I think things will become much clearer. I don't think that trying to make a major overhaul of 16.2 will actually be a very good idea. I think trying to clarify a few things may be helpful, but that can be done through, for instance, further work on the list of sectors, a good decision on contribution rates, and if you then cross-reference that in a system in the MLM, there will be a better incentive for companies to contribute, because that's what it's all about in that sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hugo. We are alas in the last 2 minutes of this webinar. I will need to leave it here. But before we close our cameras, I'd like all the panelists to turn on their cameras if they would, so that I can thank you and look you in the eye. We very much appreciate you being with us today. You have a huge amount of experience, and this has been extremely concrete and constructive and pragmatic, but clearly no one has lost their ability to innovate in terms of thinking, and the degree of ambition, I think, really remains quite high and realistic. So I wanted to thank you on behalf of the partnership for being with us today. Before we close, I also want to thank the interpreters. Without your communication and your aid, we would be remaining in ignorance largely. At least I would. So thank you very much for that. One small request to everyone online: when you end the webinar today, you click the end. You'll be asked to fill out a short evaluation of the event. We would very much appreciate it if you took a few seconds to do just that. It enabled us to know how we can improve things and enhance things. So thank you very much to everyone. We wish you a good day, a good evening. So goodbye, au revoir, hasta luego. Take care.